Good morning, everyone. I am Ashley Craig. I'm the Community Outreach Specialist here at the Library of Virginia, and thank you for joining us this morning for Immigration Records from Ellis Island Forward. Our speaker today is Cara Griggs. She is a reference archivist at the Library of Virginia, and she's one of our fabulous speakers on our genealogy workshop series. And Cara, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. And I'm going to turn off my video so you can be looking at my PowerPoint slides. And thank you for being here today. I'm going to talk about immigration from about the last quarter of the 19th century through the mid-20th century. And this presentation will be a mix of history and an overview of the types of records that document immigration during this era, including passenger lists, naturalization records, A-files, and records that are unique to immigrants and descendants of recent immigrants from countries with whom the United States was at war during World Wars I and II. Please keep in mind that this is only an overview. This is a big topic. Country of origin, year of immigration, year of naturalization, and port of entry can determine what records are available beyond what I mentioned. In addition, there are also records available in an immigrant's country of origin. And you should have a handout. The beginning has a lot of the text from my PowerPoint. My PowerPoint is mainly pictures. So you should be able to just follow along with that text. And then you have a whole lot of laws. That's just an ongoing effort on my part to collect immigration and naturalization laws and summarize them. And those are not comprehensive summaries. So if I mention a law or you find a law in there that seems to apply to what you're doing, be sure to look up that law and read it in its entirety. And finally, I have a few pages of bibliography in there for you too. And just one more thing before we get started, I am speaking about historical records and the terms that are used within them. And some terms, such as alien, are ones that I will use, but they're not ones that we would use today. Our focus today is relatively narrow, only about 75 years, but it was a significant time in U.S. history. Between 1880 and 1929 alone, more than 27 million immigrants arrived in the United States. To compare, only 9.7 million arrived in the 6 decades between 1820 and 1879, and just over 4 million arrived in the 3 decades between 1930 and 1959. These charts go through 2019, and you can see that the red area, the brownish red area on the second chart, 1880 to 1929, is huge compared to the eras that came before and after. And it's only rivaled by that big orange section, which is 1990 to 2019. Of course, bear in mind that the US population in 1900 was 76.3 million, and in 2000, it's 282.2 million. So the ratio of immigrants to native-born Americans was much higher 100 years ago. But it was more than just numbers. Immigrants were coming from different parts of the world than in the past. Look at the big orange section in most of those pie charts. That's Europe. You can see that it dominated until the 4th chart, which starts in the 1960s. Initially, Germany, Ireland, and United Kingdom, countries in Northern and Western Europe, dominated. Towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, it was Italy, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, countries in Southern and Eastern Europe, that were dominating immigration. Moreover, immigration from all parts of Asia grew from a total of nearly 225,000 between 1820 and 1879 to more than 829,000 between 1880 and 1929. And initially, 99% of all immigrants from Asia were from China. At the turn of the last century, a substantial number of immigrants still came from China, but the majority were from Turkey and Japan. And in the 3 decades after 1930, Japan and the Philippines dominated. 1930 marked the beginning of the current trend of declining numbers from Europe and Canada and increasing numbers from Mexico, Central and South America, as well as Asia, and as more decades passed, Africa and Oceania. So just as a disclaimer, these numbers are not exact. Immigration data was not compiled for every country starting in 1820, and borders changed over time. You can see that India is by itself representing South Asia. There was not a breakdown of other South Asian countries, so that's why it is by itself, for example. And it's also hard to place countries in certain regions because border changes occur and things like that. And each country has its own history, and trying to divide things up does obscure that. But I still think that these charts show trends and that these trends are important. I used the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Yearbook of Immigration Statistics for 2020 to create these charts. And the link to the sources in your handout. They provide a lot of Excel spreadsheets. When one thinks about turn of the last century immigration, one thinks about Ellis Island. Indeed, Ellis Island was the United States' first federal immigration station, and about 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island from its opening on January 1st, 1892 to 1924, when it became a detention center, before finally closing 30 years later. That is about 45% of the immigrants who came to the United States during this time period. Even though Ellis Island looms large, it was not the only port. In colonial times, ships landed wherever it was safe to do so, including in New York before Ellis Island opened. Eventually, major ports were established in Baltimore, Boston, New Orleans, New York, and Philadelphia. And the number of major and minor ports continued to increase and eventually came to include the West Coast, as well as official crossings along the Canadian and Mexican borders. It's important to remember that an immigrant may not have arrived at the closest port to that person's destination. Immigrants often left from the closest port to where they were living prior to their immigration, and they ended up where that ship docked in the United States. It may have been easier and less expensive to arrive in Canada or Mexico or Central or South America and come to the US from those countries. So their official entry record to the US could be a border crossing. Finally, all modes of travel had specific routes, so immigrants arrived based on the schedule of their steamship, train, or airplane. One way to determine the port of arrival is to search passenger lists. The Federal Steerage Act of 1819 required that lists of passengers be submitted when ships arrived at U.S. ports. It was a reaction to the conditions that immigrants endured, so there was also a restriction on how many people a ship could transport and requirements for the amount of provisions. The lists start in 1820, which is why passenger lists are abundant after that year and very scarce before that time. The lists are federal records, so the National Archives holdings are the best place to look, but it is possible that copies remained in local court or business records. Many lists have been transcribed or have been digitized on Ancestry and Family Search as well, so especially through the first few decades of the 20th century, they are fairly accessible. Bear in mind that not all lists survive and that lists that are less than 75 years old may not be publicly available because of privacy concerns. The earliest of these lists were called customs passenger lists and may contain only 5 questions. There was no standard form, so standard questions, but no standard form. And this example is from the 1854 voyage of the Saint-Denis, which departed from Le Havre, France, and arrived in New York on November 23rd. The arrow points to the Feidig family, who are Conrad, age 32, Anna, age 29, Martin, age 5, and Jacob, 11 months. Their obscure surname is spelled correctly, but that is not always the case. If an individual cannot verify the spelling, the person filling out the form simply writes what is heard. They are all listed as farmers. The list indicates that they were from Bavaria. But that's not exactly true. They were from the Palatinate, which was taken over by Bavaria and was often called Rhine Bavaria at the time. So make no assumptions about place of origin until you can find the person in that country's records. Their destination is simply the United States. Given that they settled in Richmond soon after their arrival, New York was definitely not the closest port to their destination. You can also see that even though they were German and there were German ports, they sailed from France. The final column notes the death dates of those who died on the voyage. There is no notation for the Fidex, so we can assume that all of them survived. The first page, though, opposite the arrow, does contain some notations of deaths. This later list from the SS Vera that arrived in New York from Bremen, Germany on March 17, 1884, provides a little more information. We can see that Oscar Goody was a 23-year-old merchant from Hanover, Germany, and was bound for New York. This form also notes that Goody was a second-class cabin passenger and was transient. And those are questions that were not required by the federal government, but those who were at the Port of New York decided that that information was important and they wanted to start collecting it. So it does appear on their pre-printed forms. Beginning in 1891, the records are called immigration passenger lists. A reason for this change is that the record-keeping duties were transferred from the Bureau of Customs to the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Immigration. The task later fell to the Department of Commerce and Labor and the Department of Justice until Immigration and Naturalization Service was created in 1906. So that's why you will find references to, say, the Department of Labor on immigration records. By this time, the forms used were standardized, and by 1893, the number of columns expanded to 21 and only grew from there. So now the same question should be asked of everyone. And we can learn a whole lot about Leonard Leopold and Jenny Katzenstein from the passenger list of the SS Bremen, which sailed from Bremen, Germany on April 13, 1934, and arrived in New York 6 days later. Their ages are 58 and 52 years. Leopold was a merchant and Jenny was a housewife. They are able to read and write in German. Their nationality was German, their race was Hebrew, and they were born in Rena, Germany. It also gives their visa numbers and notes that they were issued in Stuttgart on January 22nd, 1934. Their last permanent residence was Fulda, Germany. On the second page of this two-page passenger list, they note the name of a contact in Germany who was the father-in-law, Eugene Kahn of Würzburg. And I think that was actually their daughter's father-in-law, not theirs. We learned that Leopold paid for their tickets to their destination of Danville, Virginia. They answered the question of whether they had $50, with each having only $25. They'd not been to the US before, and they were going to join their son-in-law, Isaac Schuster, in Danville. Neither had ever been in prison or an almshouse or institutionalized for mental illness. They were neither polygamists nor anarchists, and they had no prearranged labor agreements. They were in good health and had no deformities. Their heights, complexions, colors of hair and eyes were recorded, and they did not have any identifying marks. And so, as you can see, we know a lot about the Katzensteins now, far more than we were able to learn about the Feidig family and Oscar Goody from their passenger lists. It is sometimes possible to find passenger lists from ports of departure, and some are available through Ancestry and Family Search, but these lists from Bremen are only available from a site sponsored by the Bremen State Archive. These lists contain little information, only that the Katzensteins travel tourist class, their genders, ages, and that they are married, their place of residence, that they speak German, they're from the province of Hessen, their occupations, and their destination. Although, if you look closely, you will see error. Danville in this list is placed in Pennsylvania and not Virginia. And yes, Oscar Goody did depart from Bremen, but the lists for his era do not survive. Of course, passenger lists are not limited to ships. Here is a 1943 list that includes Alfred Ernest Lieberman. He flew from Cuba to Florida on a Pan American Airways plane, and the manifest states only that he was male, age 28, and that he was not a citizen of any country. Also consider that an immigrant to the United States may have come by way of Canada or Mexico instead of coming directly to the US. The earliest border crossing records for Canada are from 1895, and they often look much like ship manifests. This border crossing record from St. Albans, Vermont is for Ao Chuk Sam from China from 1913. And we see from this Canadian Pacific Line manifest that he was from Sunhing, China, which is in the vicinity of Guangzhou, sailed from Hong Kong on July 16, 1913, arrived in Vancouver on August 3rd, entered the United States on October 25th, destined for Boston. So he was in Canada for a while before actually entering the US. Border crossing records from Mexico are different in that everyone has their own form, and that those who wish to become US citizens have records that are different from those who do not. And these records don't start until 1903. Maria Garza came to Del Rio, Texas via the international ferry on January 9th, 1911. A physical description is included. She was born in Zaragoza, Mexico. She's 16 years old and accompanied by her husband. She is from El Oregano, Mexico, which is not that far from her destination of Del Rio. Her contact within Mexico is her father. Her husband paid for her passage. She has no money, had never been to the US, and was in good health. And so you can see from these records, these passenger lists and even border crossings, you can potentially get a bit of genealogical information now that contacts are being listed, whether in the United States or from the country of origin. Here is a border crossing record for Rosa Sanchez, and she did not intend to stay in the US, so her record is labeled non-statistical, so it's not going to be counted in immigration statistics. We learn only that she is a 17-year-old female Mexican, no occupation, no money, and cannot read or write. She's been to the US previously and is traveling unaccompanied. Her last residence was Piedras Negras, Mexico, and her destination was Eagle Pass, Texas, which is where she crossed into the US on January 30th, 1917. These lists were originally created to ensure the safety of those who came to the US, but they eventually took on an additional importance of ensuring that an individual came to the US legally. Beginning in 1906, immigrants had to file a certificate of arrival with their petitions for naturalization to prove legal entry, and that information was derived from passenger lists. And these are the certificates for Leopold and Jenny Katzenstein, and they have only name, port of entry, date, and manner of arrival. So just some very basic information, not all of the questions that we saw from the passenger list. Be sure to take a close look at whatever records you find. Look at this citation for this certificate of arrival. Aram Karabedian's name is spelled Karabedian on his petition for naturalization, but it is spelled Carabetiin on this record. So if you're looking for his original passenger list, you're going to need that alternate spelling with a C and not the one with a K. But what happened if someone could not prove legal entry? The Registry Act of 1929 solved that problem. And registry files exist from 1929 through the beginning of 1944 and relate to arrivals from June 29th, 1906 to mid-1924. And these files basically prove how long someone has been in the US and where they've been. They begin with a registry application that provides information on the immigrant's parents, arrival information, and questions regarding the immigrant's time in the United States. Supplemental materials may include records from employers and houses of worship, affidavits and reference letters, financial records, and background checks. These records are available from the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, so you will need to contact them directly and have them locate the records for you. Older records in their holdings, like the ones I'm discussing today, are available through their genealogy program. The program covers records of those who were naturalized between April 1st, 1956, or arrived before 1945. Records after 1944 could require a FOIA request, but USCIS provides information on how to submit that paperwork. USCIS will do an index search that will find any records in their holdings for an individual. After that search, you can request copies. You can bypass the index search if you already have file numbers. More information is on their website, and a link is included in the bibliography of your handout, and I encourage you to review that site thoroughly before making a request, because they have a lot of information as well as suggestions for how to avoid some common pitfalls. USCIS has other records that are relevant to this webinar, so I will be mentioning them again, and the process is the same. Beginning on July 1st, 1924, more than just proof of legal entry was required when visas became mandatory. They became the official arrival record. This was not a new concept, but they had not been mandatory for all people before this time. They contain information found in passenger lists, as well as the names of the immigrant's parents, copies of vital records, health records, military records, affidavits, background checks, information on residences for 5 years prior to when the visa was issued, and photographs. U.S. embassies and consulates issued the visas, and only those who had visas were supposed to be admitted. So it was a way of pre-screening those who were admitted to the U.S. The records exist as a separate series of federal records through March 31st, 1944, and they are in the custody of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Here's the passenger list for Vasiliki Kampas of Greece. It lists her visa number, which was 218, that it was obtained in Marseille, France on February 25th, 1930, just before she left to join her husband. And that's the circled information on the passenger list. You may be able to find evidence of visas in personal papers. For example, here is a card that was issued to Vasiliki Kampas, indicating that she received a visa from the U.S. consulate. And here is the visa of Canadian Alice Tembrock, who crossed into the United States at Niagara Falls. And the first document is her visa application. Although perhaps a little more difficult to navigate, there are also correspondence and case files of the Immigration and Naturalization Service that are available on Ancestry. And here we see Alchuk Sam. The card indicates that he has a correspondence concerning his naturalization petition. And these records are in the holdings of the National Archives. This is a subject index. USCIS has a name index that they can search for you at your request. So there are two different indexes. The subject index, which is more difficult to navigate and not a complete name index, is what you can find online. So just know that there could be records that you're not finding in the Ancestry index. Remember that not everyone was permitted to come to the U.S. Restrictions started off slowly. As early as 1788, Virginia passed a law forbidding the importation of convicts, which was surely a reaction to the British practice of transporting convicts to their colonies. 10 years later, immigrants who were deemed dangerous could be deported. Restrictions against Asians in particular began in the last quarter of the 19th century. First, in 1875, residency permits were required for Asians to prevent the importation of those who were in the U.S. for, quote, lewd and immoral purposes, or were kidnapped victims, contract laborers, prostitutes, or convicts. And you will see a lot of references to laborers. There was fear of immigrants taking jobs away from native-born Americans. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 targeted those who were Chinese, not permitting them to enter the U.S. for 10 years, requiring certificates from Chinese laborers who were already in the U.S. and from non-laborers who wished to come, and also barred them from citizenship. By 1902, virtually all immigration from China was prohibited. Also by 1882, those who were unable to care for themselves, had mental illnesses, or would be dependent on the government for their income were excluded. In 1891, those with physical difficulties were also prohibited from coming. Immigrant receiving stations were created to assure that all who entered the United States would be here legally. In 1903, the law provided a lengthy description of who was to be excluded and added polygamists and anarchists, as well as those who did not pay for their own ticket. And we saw this reflected in the passenger list for the Katzensteins. They were asked specifically if they were polygamists, anarchists, had labor agreements, and whether they had a certain amount of money. And those seem like sort of unusual questions to be asking, but they're a direct reflection of the laws at the time and making sure that they could legally enter the United States. In 1907, there was the Gentleman's Agreement ending Japanese immigration from Japan in return for the U.S. not restricting Japanese immigrants who were already in the country. The 1917 Immigration Act summarized all of the restrictions to date and now included those who were illiterate. This act is particularly notable in that it also excluded residents of Asia who were not natives of islands possessed by the U.S. unless they were members of exempt professions, travelers, or wives or children of those who were exempt. This is what became known as the Asiatic Barred Zone, and you can see it in pink on this map. The concept of immigration quotas to limit the number of immigrants from certain countries developed by 1921. These quotas were often based on how many immigrants from particular countries were in the U.S. at the time of a census. Europeans were the most likely to immigrate to the U.S., so their percentage of the population had always been large. Immigration from other countries started later, so their numbers are more likely to be smaller, including countries from Asia. And of course, this is favoring some countries over others. But there were many excluded from these quotas, including those who were from Canada, Cuba, Mexico, Central America, and South America. And in 1924, they better defined the concept of quotas. And so you will see references to being a quota or non-quota immigrant in records, particularly in the passenger list we just saw. Vasiliki Kempis and Alice Tenbrock were non-quota immigrants because they were joining their husbands. The Katzensteins were quota immigrants. Until the mid-20th century, a passenger list entry may be the only record that is specific to immigration. Of course, there may be references to immigration in a variety of sources, such as vital records, census records, records of houses of worship, and newspapers, but not official records pertaining to immigration. But that changed in 1940. Beginning on August 1st, 1940, the United States attempted to register all immigrants over the age of 14 who had not been naturalized. Information on the registrations included name changes, residence, birth information, marital status, physical description, arrival information, employment information, membership in organizations, military service, arrest records, naturalization information, and even fingerprints. And these records were called alien registrations. These alien registration records were to be created for all non-citizens, so they may exist for individuals who arrived long before 1940, but had not been naturalized. They remain in the custody of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or may be found in A files that were transferred to the National Archives. And we'll discuss A files in a moment. This is the registration of Alice Tenbrock, as well as the card she received to verify her registration. A few years later, on April 1st, 1944, immigrant files, or A files, replaced the alien registrations. It was an attempt to create a single file for an immigrant, merging their visa file, alien registration, and perhaps a naturalization file, or information concerning refugee status into one. These files were created for everyone, so be sure to seek them out, particularly if an individual was not naturalized. The records are available from the National Archives if the birth date of an individual is more than 100 years ago, and recent files may be obtained from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And you can search the National Archives catalog by name of the immigrant for records that are in their holdings. And that's how I obtained the A file for Alice Tenbrock. Her name was in the National Archives catalog, so I contacted them and I received the copy of the A file, which was maybe about 25 pages. Until March 31st, 1956, if an immigrant naturalized, these files were changed into certificate files, or C files, that we'll discuss in a moment. But beginning on April 1st, 1956, A files became the central location for all records pertaining to an immigrant. For an immigrant who came in the 20th century, and particularly in the mid-20th century, this is likely to be your best source of information. And here are just some sample records for Alice Tenbrock from her A file. We have an employment verification from the Bank of Nova Scotia, and some paperwork beginning the naturalization process, including a background check. And I admit I have not quite solved this mystery, but she appears to have naturalized in 1950, meaning that she should have only a C file and not an A file, since the A file should have been consolidated into the C file. But this didn't always happen, so my next step is to try to track down her C file. Now let's look at naturalization records. When Virginia was still a colony, naturalizations were governed by English and Virginia laws. And there are actually two types of records: denizations that granted certain rights, which are not naturalizations, and actual naturalization records that granted all the rights of a natural-born citizen. At that time, being naturalized in Virginia did not always mean that one was considered naturalized in any other English colony. In 1790, after the Revolution was over and Virginia was part of the United States and no longer an English colony, the federal government passed legislation that standardized the naturalization process. According to this first federal law, a 21-year-old white person with 2 years residency could go to any court of record, such as a county, state, or even federal court, and take an oath of allegiance and become a citizen. In 1795, the federal government required 2 different court visits, one to file a declaration of intention and renounce foreign allegiances after at least 3 years residency, and a second at least 2 years later to file a petition for naturalization, take an oath of allegiance, and receive a certificate of naturalization. It was not necessary to go to the same court both times. This 2-step process remained in effect until 1952, although there were a lot of changes over time. Court order books are the first place to look for these records. These books chronicle all that came before the court on a certain day, from requests to record deeds to murder trials. These examples are for Franz Steinbach from the 1880s. By this time, he had anglicized his first name to Frank. He lived in eastern Henrico County, just outside of Richmond, so I checked Henrico records first. But he could have gone to any other court in the area. The first record is a declaration of intention, sometimes called first papers, and I'll read it. Frank Steinbach, William Lohman, and Christian Selbach, natives of Germany, this day declared on oath satisfactorily that it is bona fide their intention to become citizens of the United States and to renounce forever all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign power, potentate, state, or sovereign entity, whatever, and particularly to William, Emperor of Germany. A few years later, he submitted a petition for naturalizations, which is sometimes referred to as second papers. When it was approved, he received his certificate of naturalization. And the record of the second action is recorded as follows. Frank Steinbach, an alien, a native of Germany, this day applied to the court to be admitted, a citizen of the United States, whereupon the said Frank Steinbach exhibited to the court a certificate of the clerk of this court showing that he had in this court on the 11th day of May, 1883, declare and consent that it was bona fide his intention to become a citizen of the United States and to renounce from all allegiance and fidelity to every foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, whatever, and particularly to William, Emperor of Germany. And it being proved to the satisfaction of the court by the testimony of Samuel P. Waddell that since the arrival of said Frank Steinbach in the United States, he has resided within the same 5 years at least, and within the state of Virginia 1 year at least. And during that time, he has behaved as a man of good moral character, attached to the principles of the Constitution of the United States, and well disposed to the good order and happiness of the same. And the said Frank Steinbach, in open court, declared on oath that he will support the Constitution of the United States, and that he doth absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to every foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereign, whatever, and particularly to William, Emperor of Germany. And therefore the said Frank Steinbach is admitted a citizen of the United States of America. Note that it is common for several people to be mentioned together in a declaration of intention record, but people were generally listed separately for their record of their naturalization at this time. Obviously, these are not very detailed records, given that all we can expect to learn is an individual's name and country of origin. We can assume Frank Steinbach was in the United States at least 5 years prior to when he filed his petition because of the residency requirement, and in fact, he'd been in the United States for more than 20 years. It is possible to find paperwork concerning naturalizations in county court papers. Here is an example of the type of paperwork that Henrico County was issuing about a decade after Frank Steinbach was naturalized. This paperwork appears in court papers when someone had to prove evidence that he or she had filed a declaration of intention or petition for naturalization. Be sure to look for paperwork if someone filed a declaration in one court but completed the process with a petition that was filed in a different court. If both steps are filed in the same court, the clerk could just check his records for the declaration at the time that the petition was filed. If the first step was in a different court, the clerk had to receive proof. You will see that while the naturalization process was standardized, the forms were not, even within one state. Anthony Goldberg's record from the Henrico County Court is handwritten. Peter Derbyshire's record from the Superior Court, the City of New York, merely lists his name and the date that he filed his declaration. Bernard Horseman's record from Cass County Circuit Court, Indiana, lists his age, where he was born, the year, and from where he immigrated, the date and place of his arrival in the U.S. and the country of his current allegiance. John Joseph Bolfing's record from the Richmond City Hustings Court lists his occupation and country of origin. So, as I said, these records have standard questions, but they don't have standard forms. So court clerks can always include extra questions if they wish. On September 27th, 1906, there was a major change to the naturalization records. And finally, the forms were standardized and records were kept at the federal level for the first time. Localities were issued books of forms for declarations of intention and petitions for naturalization. Records should be the same no matter what the locality, although you may find declarations on non-standardized forms included with petitions if they were filed prior to 1906. Now that records were kept at the federal level, copies of the declarations of intention, petitions for naturalization, and certificates of naturalization may be found in the records of the court that naturalized the individual, as well as at the federal level in what was called certificate files or C files. The U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services maintains C files. In theory, the files kept locally and at the federal level should be the same, but there could be differences, even if it is only to request to replace a lost naturalization certificate. So I encourage you to contact USCIS to ensure that you have the full record for an individual. This is especially important from 1944 to 1956, when C files and A files were merged when someone naturalized, meaning that the C file likely contains much more than just naturalization records. So when you see these later naturalization records online or find copies in archives, which are all the examples that you're seeing today, you are finding courthouse copies since only the USCIS has the complete files and they have not digitized them. Here's an early example of a declaration of intention, and it's for Oscar Goody, whose name we saw on a passenger list. He filed this declaration in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia on April 3rd, 1917. The record notes that he was born on November 28th, 1860 in Hanover, Germany, emigrated from Bremen, Germany aboard the Vera, and arrived in New York on March 17th, 1884. He resided at 510 North Lombardy Street in Richmond. He was not married and he was employed as a clergyman. A description of his appearance is included as well. And so you can see this is an incredible amount of information compared to what we saw for Frank Steinbach, which was simply his name and his country of origin. On April 2nd, 1924, Oscar Goody filed his petition for naturalization. Much of the information is the same, but there is an alternate birth date of November 22nd, 1860. We also learned that he'd been in the U.S. continuously since September 1891, and in Virginia since September 1st, 1907. A physical description is not included on this form, but much of the other information from his declaration is repeated. 2 merchants served as witnesses, which implies that Goody had a connection to them. On the second page of the form, we see that he took his oath of allegiance on April 23rd, 1925, and became a citizen on that day. A copy of the declaration is included with the petition, and in fact, you will often find additional paperwork, including with a petition for naturalization, such as certificates of arrival and correspondence, or even a revocation of citizenship. You may want to look for a naturalization even if you know for certain that an individual never became a citizen. George Amin of Syria has a notation on the second page of his petition in the order of court denying petition section, noting that he passed away before he could complete the naturalization process. Others may have similar notations because they could not find witnesses or move to another locality before completing the process. Yet, his record is just as detailed as Oscar Goody's, who did receive citizenship. A record like this is more likely to be in a courthouse rather than at USCIS, because the USCIS's C files are for those who completed the process. And his record is an example of never knowing what you might find in the accompanying paperwork. In this case, there's a postcard of the ship on which he traveled to the United States in 1921. Of course, the forms continue to change over time, which we can see with the records of Leopold and Jenny Katzenstein, whose names we saw on a passenger list. We saw their certificate of arrival too. They each have their own complete set of records, and they opted to file them on the same days in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Virginia in Danville, which is where they lived. The declarations are really no different than the one filed by Oscar Goody. They just look different. And here's the same document that we just saw, but with a photograph. A photograph was not required on the original form, but when a copy was filed with a petition for naturalization, it had to have a photograph. This was the result of a 1929 law that requires photographs on certain naturalization documents. These certificates of arrival contain the information that was found on their passenger list. And here is Leopold Katzenstein's petition for naturalization from 1941. And his wife's is very similar. I just couldn't fit all 4 pages on this slide. Again, the information is similar to what was recorded in the past. The form just looks a little different. Note that starting in 1906, records contain the names of spouses and children. So you will note that the Katzensteins had 2 daughters, and they immigrated as well, and I found their naturalization records. Finally, certificate of naturalization stubs were filed with the other paperwork, and certificate of naturalization books issued by the government had perforated pages. The stub could remain in the book and the certificate given to the new citizen. I don't have a certificate for the Katzensteins, but they would be similar to the one that Alchek Sam was issued in 1944. These documents are generally found in USCIS C files or in collections of personal papers, since the certificate was given to the new citizen. It's important to remember that citizenship was not open to everyone. The United States First Naturalization Act in 1790 specified that only whites who were at least 21 years old and of good moral character could become citizens. In 1870, federal law stated for the first time that individuals from Africa could become citizens, which implies that for the first time, immigrants who were not white could be naturalized. This left questions as to whether immigrants from Asia could be naturalized. Chinese were excluded based on the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. In the 1922 Supreme Court case Ozawa versus United States concerning Takao Ozawa from Japan, the court determined that white meant Caucasian. The 1923 Supreme Court case United States versus Bhagat Singh Thund resulted in the decision that individuals from India could not be naturalized. In fact, those who had been naturalized had their citizenship revoked. To further emphasize these rulings, the law was passed in 1940, specifying that only, quote, white persons, persons of African nativity or descent, and descendants of races indigenous to the Western Hemisphere could become citizens. And the law also restricted that only those who could speak English, do not support the overthrow of the U.S. government, have not deserted the military, have resided in the U.S. for at least 5 years, and within the state of intended residence for at least 6 months may become citizens. And ultimately, Chinese immigrants could not become citizens until 1943, Indians until 1946, and Japanese until 1952. Women were also treated differently and were not mentioned in naturalization laws until 1804. The law stated that if a man died before completing the naturalization process, his wife and children could become citizens by taking an oath of allegiance. Beginning in 1855, a woman could become a citizen if she married a U.S. citizen, meaning that her citizenship was derivative. It was not until 1922 that women were required to go through the naturalization process themselves to become a U.S. citizen and could no longer rely on marriage. You may want to search for the naturalization records of women who married non-citizens because from 1907 to 1922, they lost their citizenship when they married. In 1931, a law was passed that allowed women to retain their citizenship if they married and could regain citizenship if it was lost through marriage to a non-citizen. So you will find American-born women petitioning to be naturalized because of their marriages. Some immigrants were perceived as threats to the United States and may have additional records. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 generated an enormous number of records that are unique to Chinese immigrants. A couple times before, we have seen Alchek Sam, this border crossing and naturalization certificate. And here is Alchek Sam again with his border crossing from Canada. According to the terms of the 1882 Act, a separate list of Chinese passengers had to be compiled, and that's what this is. Notice the dates of admittance on the second page. Alchek Sam was initially denied admittance to the U.S., but won his appeal which is the reason why he remained in Canada for several months before entering the U.S. And there are also lists of laborers and records of those who left but sought to be admitted. Chinese exclusion of case files are a result of investigations of individuals from China who wish to come to the United States. This file is for Ao-Chuk Sam, but it also provides information on his family and even includes his photo as well as photos of his parents and sister. His father began the process in advance of their arrival. And these are just a few pages from his file. I think he has about 70 some pages. He has another file in 1918, and his family has files, including siblings that were born in the US. Other records are related to times of war. The US passed a law regarding, quote, enemy aliens in 1798, and it's still in effect. It states in part that, quote, all native citizens, denizens, or subjects of the hostile nation or government, being males of the age of 14 years and upwards, who shall be within the United States and not actually naturalized, shall be liable to be apprehended, restrained, secured, and removed as enemy aliens. After the war was declared on Germany to begin the US involvement in World War I, regulations on non-citizens from countries that were at war with the US followed on April 6, 1917, that restricted movement, did not allow possession of firearms or secret codes, and prohibited assisting the enemy. The list of restrictions expanded in November of 1917, and registration was now required. Initially, it was just for men, but it expanded in April of 1918 to include women. For the most part, these registrations do not survive, including for Virginia, although I did find a set of registration affidavits from Kansas, and this is for Mary Eleanor Bush. She was born in Harrison County, West Virginia, but married John M. Bush from Germany, and therefore she's suspect. So she's an example of someone who was born here but is suspect just because of her marriage. And although they're not digitized, the National Archives does have records of individuals who are questioned and imprisoned under the regulations on Germans for World War I. Another source of information is newspapers. Oscar Goody, who we've met before, was the minister of St. John's German Evangelical Lutheran Church in Richmond. And a statement appeared in the Evening Journal that the church had, quote, issued a lengthy statement setting forth its position regarding the war. The statement denies that there are any traitors in the church. The pastor, Reverend Oscar Goody, is the author of the statement. The article goes on to state that there are only 3 enemy aliens in the congregation of the church. One day later, and again the following week, the same newspaper berated Goody for not having naturalized and wondered how he could serve a church that was regarded as American when he was German. He had in fact submitted his declaration of intention several days prior to the registration law, a fact that was published in rival newspapers. Goody was investigated by the Bureau of Investigation beginning in May of 1917, and by early 1918, they concluded that despite reports, Goody was, quote, very pro-German prior to our entrance into the war, but since nothing has been heard of him in the way of making pro-German utterances or committing hostile acts. This record was digitized by Fold 3 in the Old German Files series, 1950 to 1920. It's also a series for Mexicans from 1909 to 1921 concerning those who were considered enemies of the US during the Mexican Civil Wars, but I don't think they've been digitized. The US was not so hardcore that they did not allow those who were regarded as enemy aliens to serve in the military. They were not liable for the draft, but they could certainly sign up if they wished. And as a side note, those who were from neutral countries who opted out of the draft if they wished, but it resulted in their losing the right to naturalize forever. Likewise, in World War II, those classified as enemy aliens could serve except for individuals from Japan. In 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt issued proclamations with restrictions on citizens of Japan Germany, and Italy that were similar to those imposed on enemy aliens in World War I. And ultimately, the U.S. interned 31,000 people, including those who were deported from Latin America for the purpose of being imprisoned. The National Archives has many of these records, but they're not all indexed and available online through their catalog. President Franklin Roosevelt's 1942 Executive Order 9066 was used to justify incarcerating individuals of Japanese descent. And the next month, they were given 48 hours to leave their homes, and 122,000 individuals were sent to assembly centers and then to relocation camps. 70,000 of those who were incarcerated were U.S. citizens. The National Archives has a database of those who were incarcerated, and here's the entry for Rio Sato. If we look further down, we will see that she was incarcerated even though she had never actually been to Japan. If we look for her on Ancestry, we will find her in a list of those who were incarcerated at Heart Mountain, noting that she was originally from California, but would be going to Cleveland. And that is very common. Those who were incarcerated often did not go back to where they were living prior to the war. They went on to other cities. And there are case files that are available from the National Archives, but they haven't been digitized. In contrast, those who were perceived as loyal were rewarded. The federal government relaxed its naturalization laws again for those who served in the U.S. military during World War I. Members of the U.S. military who were overseas on or before May 9th, 1918 are still in the U.S. awaiting deployment, did not need to file a declaration of intention or proof of legal entry, and could file a petition for naturalization in any court of record. The residency requirement and fees were waived. Civilian naturalization records were filed in the state in which the individual intended to live, but military naturalizations were more likely filed where the individual was stationed at the time. And you can see that they use the same form as civilian naturalizations, but they're not quite the same because they contain information on military service. We learned from this record that John Strub, who was from Poland, enlisted on July 20th, 1918, and served in the 29th Company of the 10th Training Battalion of the 155th Depot Brigade at Camp Lee. And military naturalizations for this era don't always contain the same level of detail as civilian naturalizations, probably because they were done very quickly. They may only provide a country and not exact place of origin, or may not even have arrival information. The U.S. relaxed its naturalization laws again during World War II, and the provisions were very similar to the ones from World War I, most notably that a declaration of intention was not required. The U.S. had been requiring literacy tests and even had a place for that information on naturalization forms by 1906, but those were waived. But this time legal entry was required. These forms are specific for World War II naturalizations. And for World War I, you can see they were just using the same form, but in 1940s, they decided to opt for a form specific for military naturalizations. And you will see at the top, it cites section 701 of the 1940 Nationality Act, and that's actually a 1942 amendment. 1940 Act does not have a section 701. And this is the naturalization petition for Ao-Chuk Sam. And we saw his arrival information from 1913. We know he's been in the US for a long time, but actually on his petition, he has arrival via the Detroit and Canada Tunnel on April 14th, 1944. And we've seen his certificate before, but this is what he would have received after submitting that petition for naturalization. And I know we're about at time and I'm running a bit over, and we are at our conclusion though. I just want to emphasize that in the time that followed, the one that we've just been talking about, there were major changes. Following World War II, there were laws that could be considered to be the opposite of all of the restricted quota laws that were passed in previous decades. This new law focused on resettling refugees that were victims of the Nazis and who had not yet found a permanent residence. Quotas remained, but refugees were heavily favored. It permitted 400,000 people to enter the U.S. between 1948 and 1952. More changes came in 1952 with the Immigration and Naturalization Act. The quota system remained, as did the Canada, Mexico, Central America, and South America exemption. The Asiatic barred zone disappeared, but those from what was termed the Asian Pacific Triangle were limited to 2,000 immigrants per year, and those with one parent from that area, even if they were born elsewhere, were included in that quota. The most significant change concerned naturalization. The age for naturalization decreased to 18 for the first time since before 1795, and declarations of intention were no longer required. Building on laws from the World Wars, expedited naturalizations were extended to all who were in the armed forces, and children gained citizenship along with their parents if they were under the age of 16. The quota system that I've mentioned so many times did not disappear until 1965. This particular act limited visas to 20,000 per country per year and gave preference to relatives and skilled workers. So it was intended to be a more equal system. And that brings us to the end of this webinar. We covered a lot of material in a short amount of time. I encourage you to take a look at the National Archives and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services websites that are in your bibliography and to read the laws that are relevant to your research for more details. And especially those two websites, a lot more information is included. And as I noted in the beginning, country of origin, year of immigration, year of naturalization, and place of entry can determine what records are available in the U.S. and elsewhere. Thank you for watching this webinar, and I am happy to answer questions.
Hi, Cara. We only have a couple of questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. The first question I can answer, it's a general housekeeping question. The recording will be sent out after the webinar, probably be sent out sometime next week. So please stay tuned to your email so that you can see the recording. Cara, my personal question is, what happens to women? Where do you find women in early immigration records?
Well, for naturalizations, they just might not be there because they didn't need to. So if you find a naturalization for a father or a husband, then the daughter or wife is just assumed to be included. That's what I find rather intriguing. In the 1906 petitions, they do have a place to list a spouse, but early on, you saw the naturalization for Franz Steinbach. He was married at the time and his wife was an immigrant, but there's no mention of her anywhere. We just have to consider she's naturalized now. But certainly after women are required to naturalize in 1922 and fill out the paperwork in their own right, that's where you start seeing them in great abundance. And of course, you do have that odd time where women were born here but not citizens because of who they married. So there are a whole lot of those Kansas records that I was paging through before I settled on that one. And you know, this is not an unusual situation. So that's where you'll find them. Of course, you will find them on the passenger list that have to include everyone.
Alrighty. Can you also speak of the Department of Unclaimed Properties and where you might be also to find some immigration records there? Okay.
My examples of personal papers came from unclaimed property. We have these collections of unclaimed property from the Department of the Treasury. If you abandon property in your safe deposit box and you can't be tracked down and your descendants or anybody, then it can potentially come to the Library of Virginia. We don't get the objects that are left in there. We get any papers that are deemed of interest. And so that's a leaky compass and our checksum abandoned safe deposit boxes. So that's how we managed to get those few records. And I've gone through pretty much all the ones that have immigration records that I could find in the catalog. Each file is cataloged individually, and they are a wonderful source of records that you can't get to any other way, because they, you know, that Visa card, that's going to be just given to her. There's not necessarily going to be another one somewhere. So that's why they were used pretty heavily in this and for my research.
Okay, we have one more question. Where does one look for immigration records in Virginia before federal records were kept?
That's the examples that I had of Franz Steinbach. It's the court order books, and that's going to be the official record, is what you find in the court order. They would have been issued pieces of paper, but you know, who knows if you could find that now. But you just have to go through court order books, and I would start with the closest court to where the person was living, and then branch out. So if you're living in Richmond, you've got a federal court you could go to. You could go to your local hustings court. You find them sometimes in strange places. There's a court of equity. It's called Chancery Court. That's where they decide divorces and figure out what to do if someone dies without a will. I found Chancery records there. Going back a bit further, back when Virginia was actually in the Confederate States of America, there are Confederate naturalizations in Confederate court records. So that's the place to look. Most court order books are indexed. They aren't always. I believe with my Frank Steinbach example, I was able to find one of the records by looking in the index, but the other one was in an unindexed volume, and I just had to go through every page of it until I found it. So that's where you need to look at the court orders. They're on microfilm here up to about 1900, available through interlibrary loan. You might be able to find them on Family Search by searching their catalog. There is a separate webinar for searching that, or I can answer questions. Ashley can answer questions how to do that.
All right. Well, thank you, Cara, for giving us a wonderful presentation this morning. And thank you all for joining us. Our next genealogy workshop will be in November, and that workshop will be focusing on our newspaper collection at the Library of Virginia. Thank you all for joining us today, and see you soon.
Thank you.